Hello, welcome to Between the Rows. I'm your guest host, Bruce Thorson. Yeah, I'm a new voice for BTR, and I wanted to share some new developments with you. You can now find us on YouTube. Just search Between the Rows Podcast. I repeat, Between the Rows Podcast. You'll find the latest episodes as well as our evergreen archive. And we're going to be using YouTube as a space to post resources from our stories and even pictures and video. We're also hoping it's going to be a place where you'll drop us a line and let us know what you think about BTR, or tell us about a story in your community we should be taking a look at. So again, head over to YouTube and search for Between the Rows Podcast. Okay, back to our regularly scheduled programming. First, there was the pandemic, then the drought. The pressures building on farmers are touching every part of their lives, from their pocketbook to their mental health. And this week's show takes a look at both. We'll be talking with Alberta Farmer Express reporter Alexis Kienlen about a vicious 1-2 punch in the shape of crop failures and sky-high prices, leaving some producers facing huge penalties for unfulfilled grain contracts.
A lot of producers have done some forward contracting, so they've contracted a portion of their grain. And unfortunately, they might not be able to meet those contracts because they just simply don't have enough yield, they don't have enough crop.
And then we'll be looking at solutions, a ray of light in the shape of Gerry Friesen, otherwise known as the recovering farmer. Gerry's an expert on stress management and mental health in the ag sector.
When we seek help from professionals, we need to talk to someone, or we feel we need to talk to someone that has an in-depth knowledge of the intricacies of agriculture. And just anecdotally, someone suggested to me the other day a farmer had gone to see a doctor about the stress they were experiencing, and the doctor had written a note saying that they needed to take 2 weeks off. Well, that's not the reality of farming, right?
But first, a word from our sponsor.
Part of being a farmer is being an accountant, and a mechanic, and a chemist. You have lots on the go. So FarmLink makes your grain marketing go further. We help you reach your financial goals with calculated sales decisions. No bias, just solutions and results. Plus, with our new app GrainFox, we bring every opportunity right to your fingertips. Literally. Start seeing the returns that'll get your family ahead. You've earned it. FarmLink. Your work is worth more. Get started at farmlinksolutions.ca.
There's something about that cowboy ethos, self-reliance, doggedness, the man or woman of few words, that rings true with a lot of farmers. The spirit of rugged individualism and entrepreneurship. But what happens when you can't stand alone? The crops fail, there's sickness in the air, the banks come calling. It can be too much for one person to handle on their own. It can hammer away at your mental health. Now and then, even the rugged individualist needs someone to lean on. Gerry Friesen has been working with farmers and questions around mental health for over a decade. Here's part 1 of our interview.
Okay, my name is Gerry Friesen, Bruce. I often refer to myself as a recovering farmer. I used to farm. It didn't end well, but it did end. And during the course of that, I experienced some significant mental health issues. And so that's a journey that still continues today. And I guess in an odd sense, I like to talk about it. I've certainly knew in the depth of my misery, as I sometimes call it, that talking to other people is a huge help. And so that's what I like to do.
And there's a bit more to it than that. You've been pursuing this, in various ways ever since. Can you maybe give us a sense of how you do this, where you do this, who you do this
Yeah,
with?
it's interesting. I sometimes say that in the 90s I was involved in agricultural politics. I was involved with as chairman of Manitoba Pork when we went to open marketing, some other commodity groups that I was involved in. And then in 2000, actually, I was appointed to the Manitoba Farm Mediation Board and understood that there was something there that kind of came naturally for me. So I pursued that. eventually started my own business. But when the farm was winding down in 2007, I actually applied to be a volunteer for the Manitoba Farm and Rural Stress Line, uh, as talking to people on the phone. And that again added something, I guess, to my life. It felt good doing that. I enjoyed doing that. And through the course of that, I was asked to share about my own journey publicly back in 2010. And basically, I sometimes say I started talking about it then, and I haven't quit talking about it.
One of the reasons we wanted to talk to you at this particular juncture is that a lot of farmers out there now are feeling the double whammy of first COVID and then the drought. And we wanted to reach out to people who maybe had some insight and some advice, some tools to lend to people to help them get through these particular times. So with that in mind, is there something, is there something you can tell us to help us,
Well,
move forward?
and I suppose, Bruce, that's $1 million question, and it's sometimes difficult to answer that because as human beings, all of us experience things, but we also all experience it differently. But you say farmers have had a tough go of it, even before COVID hit. I recall the fall just before COVID hit. There were some interruptions with freight. There was other challenges farmers were experiencing, and then just when they thought they were through that, then like you say, COVID hit, which changed things. And then now, of course, with a drought, and I know where I live in the Red River Valley, we're basically into at least, I believe, the third year of drought. And so it has been incredibly challenging for farmers. And the University of Guelph actually did a survey in 2016, I believe it was, which was quite revealing in what it showed. They interviewed or surveyed 1,100 producers across Canada, and the number that really sticks out for me on that one, Bruce, is that they identified that 58% of the people surveyed met the criteria for anxiety disorder, which is kind of mind-numbing almost, because that means 50% of the people, if they would go seek help from a professional, they would be diagnosed with an anxiety disorder. And so that's just an indication of how dire it is out there and how each year seems to bring about added challenges. And producers are seeking help more and more. I'm very happy that the conversation about mental health and agriculture has been increasing. It's opening doors. It's getting people to feel more comfortable talking about it, because we all know that there's long been a stigma associated with that. And so people are starting to talk about it more. And like I said originally to you, talking about it is one of the big steps in actually being able to help yourself with the stress you're going through. One of the common themes I've heard, in the many farm families I've dealt with in farm debt mediation, other farmers I have talked to when I do my presentations, is that more and more people are stepping out and saying, yeah, gosh, you know what? I do have an issue and I need to deal with it. And how can I best deal with it? And so I'm happy to see that is starting to happen more.
Well, it's not just the double whammy of COVID and the drought. There's also the particular circumstances of the farming life. You're in a rural district. It's not necessarily an easy thing to get medical assistance. Never mind mental health assistance, which is often a very counseling is often a protracted personal one-on-one thing, and when you're working on a farm, how the heck do you do that? And the second thing is there's a tradition of the cowboy spirit, the independent entrepreneur. So you're not supposed to be the person who takes that avenue of help. How do you see those twin, I don't know what I call them, hurdles, I guess?
Well, you're absolutely right, Bruce. I'm from the generation where men in particular, if they were experiencing any type of stress issues or mental health issues, basically we were told to work harder. We could work our way through it, and I tried that back in 2003 when I was first diagnosed. I certainly tried that, and very quickly came to the conclusion that that wouldn't work. And yes, we're isolated out in rural Manitoba or anywhere in Canada. And when you live on a farm, and it feels very much like you're alone out there. Um, but and sorry, and the third piece to that is the fact that when we seek help from professionals, we need to talk to someone, or we feel we need to talk to someone that has an in-depth knowledge of the intricacies of agriculture. And just anecdotally, someone suggested to me the other day a farmer had gone to see a doctor about the stress they were experiencing, and the doctor had written a note saying that they needed to take 2 weeks off. Well, that's not the reality of farming, right?
That's the first half of my interview with stress management expert Gerry Friesen. In the second half of our conversation, Gerry will share advice and resources, where to turn and who to turn to help sustain mental health as a farmer. But first, we're going to take a look at one of the latest threats to that mental health. We caught up with Alexis Kienlen to talk about her story for Alberta Farmer Express on how dismal crops are leaving some farmers facing huge penalties for unfulfilled grain contracts. Okay, Alexis, thanks for joining us to talk about this story of yours. And I think the best way to introduce it is the way it's introduced in the actual article. Drought battered farmers facing another crisis, contract penalties. What is this about? What's going on?
Well, what it's about is that the basically because of the drought and the heat dome that we had and the extreme heat that we had over some areas of the prairies, there isn't as much crop as people expected. Yields are very low, and there's a lot of producers have done some forward contracting, so they've contracted a portion of their grain. And unfortunately, they might not be able to meet those contracts because they just simply don't have enough yield, they don't have enough crop, and so yeah, they will not be able to meet their contracts.
So this is sort of it's a way of placing a bet on yourself. I'm expecting this much yield, so I'm going to, hopefully these contracts are going to work out for me in this year, an exceptional year. Things have definitely not turned out the way people anticipated. What's the scale of this?
It's at this point, no one really knows the scale. It's one of the many problems is that it is a very the drought is widespread, but it's also very patchy. So we don't know how it's so different in every area.
So these number of problems, if we just list them off here, make sure I'm understanding this correctly. There's the drought, number one.
Yes.
Number two, the patchiness, which you referred to. So it's difficult to gauge what this is. Of course, there's the very high prices we were seeing earlier in the year, which, I'm guessing that made people optimistic about what they could be looking forward to this year.
Yeah.
Is that all the contributing factors we've got to deal with at this point?
I would think so, yes. There's also just the fact that with the way these contracts are set out, according to someone who messaged me on Twitter, it has happened, but generally the large grain producers don't let you just get out of a contract. You've signed it, you're expected to provide. So you will have to pay the difference of the grain that you don't have made up. You can possibly get out of contract if there's an act of God clause, but typically those are only in the smaller crops, such as pulses, flax, and kind of the specialty crops. So for wheat and canola, you pretty much have to fill your contract.
Now, given that, as you noted, this extends from British Columbia to Ontario, it's hurting vast numbers of people across a vast amount of land. There are provincial and federal programs for different aspects of the drought that people are trying to put forward. Is there any recognition of this? Is there anywhere where people can turn to help from the government?
At this point, I haven't heard of anything for grain producers for contracts. What people have recommended, like everyone I talked to my story says that in my story said that the first thing you should do if you think you're going to be short on a contract is contact your grain buyer. You should have an upfront conversation with them and kind of let them know that what your situation is so that you can negotiate with them. Because the thing is, like, it seems like the grain company is just evil wanting your grain, but they are beholden to other buyers and sellers, most often people in other countries, and it kind of goes along the chain. So, and also the Canadian Canola Growers Association has like kind of a little booklet that you can read that can maybe, I think it's on their website. People have been passing around, and it has some suggestions of what you can do. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's much you can do, but there are a few suggestions there.
Okay, again, to summarize this, we don't know if there's going to be any governmental intervention, any help at this point, number one. Number two, you can't really turn to your neighbors like you did in the old days to help fulfill your contract obligations, because there just isn't enough to go around. And number three, the companies themselves are beholden to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
Now you mentioned this booklet, but is there nowhere else that you've come across where people can turn to get help? I'm just trying to see if there's anything else out there for people.
No, as far as I've found, no. And even on Twitter, people were talking about like government aid for crop producers, and people were saying like that they're expecting the government aid will go to the cattle producers who are really having a rough time. One thing that did come up too during the research and is in the story is the Western Canadian Grain Growers Association. I think the Western Canadian Grain Association, I think it's called. Their chair is Daryl Francouz, and he is talking with a lot of farmers about kind of the administration costs that go on top of these contracts. Because that's another thing, is that for some of the farmers, they can't pay their contract, and then they're slapped with a bunch of administration fees, which the Western Canadian Grain Association and various people don't feel that that's really fair. And so they're just trying to get a handle on what's happening in that area as well.
So Alexis, if you were to give one piece of advice to someone who finds himself in this situation, what would that be?
My piece of advice would be, if you don't think you'll be able to meet your contract, you should contact your grain buyer as soon as possible and start talking to them about it.
Okay, Alexis, thanks very much for joining the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was Alexis Kienlen from Alberta Farmer Express. Now, for the second half of my conversation with the recovering farmer, Gerry Friesen. We've learned a bit about who you are, and we've learned a little bit about the particular circumstances of obtaining mental health help in an agricultural sense. What can people do? What resources are out there that people can access?
Well, again, first and foremost, we can keep it quite simple, and that is that we need to be open to talk about it. And again, I share a story quite often of when I was feeling incredible stress. There was stuff that had happened. My neighbor popped by and asked me how I was doing. And of course, my normal response would be, I'm doing fine, right? But for some reason that day, I started talking about what I was experiencing. And for half an hour, my neighbor listened to me, didn't provide answers, but normalized and validated what I was feeling. And that took a big load off my mind, because very often stress, anxiety, depression can get our brains working in overtime and basically making up stuff that's really not real. And so we're mired in that. But when we verbalize this stuff, very often, it's the person that's listening is normalizing and validating, saying you're not alone in this. And also, when you verbalize these things, you come to the understanding that, a lot of the stuff I'm thinking isn't real. And so that's a huge first step. Secondly, there's rural stress lines in some of the provinces. I know we have one in Manitoba. Unfortunately, in my mind at least, it was moved to Winnipeg, I believe, just over a year ago. To me, it feels like it's basically a farm line in name only now. For the first 20 years of its existence, there were people answering the call that had that knowledge of farming. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Um, there's farmer wellness programs. One in Prince Edward Island, for example. There's another one in Ontario, and although I shouldn't maybe say this, but I will say it, I've actually been working together with another person and trying to get that into Manitoba. That it's something that's really needed. And then you have an organization like Do More Ag that's been working a lot on stress in agriculture. I know Do More Ag, together with Farm Credit Canada, um, produced a booklet a couple of years ago that's basically a dashboard, if you want to call it that. That's very simple to follow. It helps people identify where their stress levels may be at. It helps them identify the steps they can take. It provides resources because the resources are out there. We have Google these days, and it's interesting what you can find just simply on your computer to try and help you through a lot of the issues you're facing. So the resources are starting to come out more and more. I know that the Standing Committee on Agriculture did an in-depth study of agriculture and stress a couple of years ago. They've identified a need out there. Provincial governments are getting on board with stuff that can be done to help farmers. So the resources are out there, but very often, and in a lot of cases, it's people being hesitant to take that first step that's needed because they feel ashamed, which is unfortunate. They feel lost. They don't know where to turn. And yet, it's not, in a lot of cases, it's a simple phone call that can actually get them started down the right path. And there's some simple stuff that as individuals we can do. And again, sometimes when I talk to farmers about this, I kind of cringe a wee bit because, of course, one of the first things you'll find when you Google stress management is exercise. And as farmers, of course, exercise normally, particularly this time of year, isn't lacking. There's a lack of sleep. Yeah, I read just recently that not sleeping well, or the number of hours you really need to get a rest, can increase your stress by 30%, which is significant. So we have to make an effort to sleep when we possibly can. We have to make sure we eat right. I've certainly noticed that. I sometimes, when I'm on by myself at home, I'll skip meals, for example, and I can certainly feel that take effect. And as far as my mental health goes, one of the big ones is that we need to try, when we're experiencing the stress, is identify things that we can control and things we can't control. And I know this is easier said than done, particularly when we're watching the weather. But when there's things that we can't control, if at all possible, we can put them aside, because that'll shorten the list of what's stressing you out, and you'll be able to manage your stress a lot better. Like I've said a few times, we need to talk about it, whether it's to a neighbor, whether it's to family, or seek professional help. One of the tricks, and this is just a short trick that people can utilize, and I like talking about it. Some years ago, when I went to see a therapist, and she was trying to help me, and she kind of got frustrated because I kept telling her, well, I know about cognitive behavioral therapy, and I know about this, and I know about that. And she finally, in exasperation, asked me, well, what can I help you with? And I said that my mind very often uh, just goes in overdrive, thinking about stress, thinking about all the stuff that's going on. And I said, I'll wake up at night and feel anxious and be thinking about these things. And she said, there's a very simple trick. She said, when you're deep in thought about something, if you take note, your tongue is firmly up against the roof of your mouth. So when you wake up at night and you're feeling anxious, she said, just simply drop your tongue. And I kind of chuckled when she told me that, and yet that's a trick that I've tried. It works very well. At first, before I started talking about it publicly, I would talk to friends and others that would approach me and say, try this. And invariably, they came back and said, yes, that works very well. So there are these simple tricks. And I sometimes say, you know what, if you're in a funk, if your thinking isn't, sometimes I refer to it as stinking thinking, if that's the route you're on, drop your tongue. And what it does is it brings you back into the present and really helps you focus on other things rather than a lot of these negative thoughts that have a tendency to slip into our thinking.
It's funny because once you said that, I realized that I was listening intently to you and that my tongue was at the top of my mouth. And as soon as you said drop it, I dropped it and I felt relief.
Yeah, it's incredible how that works. And I was actually surprised when this therapist pointed this out to me. I kind of said, well, why haven't I heard about this before, right? But so the point being, there's these minor things that we sometimes don't realize can be quite helpful. So if we utilize those, particularly if we're in a busy time when we don't have the time to drive into town or go see a professional, try these simple things to get yourself through this period, and then look at broadening, your search for other resources.
Okay, Gerry. Well, thanks very much for joining us on the show today. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate the opportunity, Bruce. Thank you.
If you'd like to have a look at some of the mental health resources Gerry mentioned, head on over to our YouTube channel. Just search Between the Rows Podcast, and there you'll find links to those resources. Okay, that's it for today's show. I've been your guest host, Bruce Thorson. Have a great week.
Part of being a farmer is being an accountant, and a mechanic, and a chemist. You have lots on the go, so FarmLink makes your grain marketing go further. We help you reach your financial goals with calculated sales decisions. No bias, just solutions and results. Plus, with our new app GrainFox, we bring every opportunity right to your fingertips, literally. Start seeing the returns that'll get your family ahead. You've earned it. FarmLink, your work is worth more. Get started at farmlinksolutions.ca.